what you would expect or what you would want to see in a church. I hope that the facilities were clean and we could probably keep on going and going and going with these kinds of things. It was interesting to me as I was sitting down just kind of thinking along those lines this week, how many of these different things would fall into some of the categories that we've been considering as we talk about church here in 1 Corinthians 11 and 12 and 13. We could talk about what the church teaches, the doctrine of the church, the preaching of the church, right? We could talk about the behavior and how we get along with one another. We could talk about the heart of the church for God and for others. And we remember we spent last week some time there in 1 Corinthians 13. It's interesting how many, perhaps you've been in a church where things of this nature were not cared for properly, were not done properly, where the average person, perhaps a normal person from the outside looking in would see that and say that is a problem that needs to be fixed in that church. In all honesty, I would full well expect that there are things that you could look at about our church and say, that's broken, Pastor. That's not what it ought to be. The truth is, I was talking with Micah here a little bit not too long ago. Is there anybody in here that would say our church is absolutely perfect? Completely holy, completely righteous, right? Everything is exactly what it ought to be, right? I don't think any of us would say like quite like that, right? I mean, we love our church. We like our church. I'm glad for our church. I'm not saying that kind of stuff. But if we all recognize that our church is not perfect, then what's broken about our church? And it won't be perfect. It's not supposed to be perfect, and it can't be perfect without until we see Christ. One day when that church is all together, when we are that whole body of Christ gathered around what a glorious day that is going to be. Like Revelation 4 and 5, if you want a little bit of a preview on what that's going to feel like, right? But if our church is broken, what needs to be fixed? That's a tougher question sometimes, isn't it? I certainly think that our church is moving the right direction. But how different is our church going to be this time next year? I know we can't predict the future, but if our church is not what our church ought to be, shouldn't our church look different here in the space of a year or so? Can things that are broken in church even be fixed? Sometimes, there are things going on in churches. Think of the church at Corinth, right? What everybody knows about the church in Corinth, that the immorality, the wickedness, the pride, some of these things that we've touched on here over the last couple of weeks here. There was some really big problems going on in the church at Corinth. Did the church in Corinth stop being the church just because it was broken? No, it didn't. And in fact, the fact that we have a book like 1 Corinthians shows us that these kinds of problems can indeed be fixed. Think in your mind, I won't have you turn to it here at this point, but think in your mind to the book of Revelation again, chapters 2 and 3, those letters that Jesus wrote to the churches in Asia Minor there. There was, again, some really significant problems that Jesus addressed. Some of them were doctrinal. Some of them believed the doctrine of the Nicolaitans, the doctrine of Balaam. They had some really not good things happening in some of those churches.